What if the greatest risk in your next master plan isn't cost overruns, but strategic drift? Most health systems begin master planning with buildings, bed counts, towers, adjacencies, square footage, all necessary conversations, and all responsible conversations. But often, they happen before something more foundational is clarified: posture. Because when you commit capital at scale, you're not just constructing space. You're hardening assumptions about your care model, your workforce structure, your referral flows, and your financial resilience for the next 10 to 20 years. In this episode, we reset the conversation. Using a fictional but very familiar system, Riverside Health, we walk through 5 structural requirements that separate facility planning from true or strategic master planning. This isn't about square footage. It's about whether your capital is reinforcing legacy or clarifying strategy. If you're a healthcare executive, board member, planner, architect, or strategist navigating long-term investment decisions, this episode will challenge how you think about master planning and what discipline it really requires in uncertain environments. Let's get into it. Let's start with something that may sound a little simple. Most master planning processes begin with buildings. They start with things like, hey, we're running out of capacity. This tower is really aging. It's starting to fail. It's really old. It's not looking the greatest. This competitor across the street just announced a big expansion. Maybe we should do something to combat that. Maybe there's a new CEO, a new executive in place, a new leadership team, a new board, and they want to reset a long-term vision around their goals. Almost immediately, this conversation turns into square footage. How many beds do we need? How many beds do we have? How many ORs do we need? How many ORs do we have? What are our adjacencies? What's broken? What's not working? Does our infrastructure have the capacity for us to expand? All of these are very necessary and very important conversations. But there's a quiet problem that's not addressed. We must jump into the mechanics before we clarify our posture, and the posture is what master planning is really about. Once you commit capital at such a scale, you're not just building space. You're locking in assumptions about how care will be delivered, where those services will concentrate, how your workforce will be structured, and how resilient your balance sheet needs to be. Buildings harden strategy. And if the strategy wasn't fully vetted or challenged before the planning began, you won't notice the constraint until years later. Most master plans don't fail dramatically. They age strategically. They slowly become misaligned with the direction the organization is trying to move. And by the time you feel it, the capital is already committed. So today, I don't want to talk about master planning as a facilities process. I want to talk about it as a key component of strategy. We're going to walk through 5 structural requirements, and to keep this grounded, we'll follow one fictional health system, Riverside, through the entire conversation. As we go through, I want you to ask yourself, are we committing capital to comfort or to clarity? So Riverside. This fictional example may sound not too dissimilar from maybe your own organization or organizations you've worked with in the past. Riverside Health, 3-hospital system. They're 25 miles apart with a downtown flagship campus and a growing suburban campus, with the 3rd campus being an older, aging community hospital. Margins are tight but positive, workforce is stretched thin, and outpatient growth is quickly accelerating. The inpatient population is stable, but not growing meaningfully, and they're launching a 15-year master plan where everything we're about to discuss is happening inside the system. Maybe this is similar to yours. Let's start with the first requirement or the first must-have of master planning. Define the role before you define the space. Let's tighten this up. Before you program space, you must define the role. Not historically, not politically, but strategically. Role clarity means what this campus concentrates on. What does it want to be known for? What it intentionally does not do, and how this strengthens the overall system as a whole, how it interacts with other campuses in referral patterns and capital allocation. At Riverside, the first draft of the master plan distributed investment across all 3 campuses. It felt balanced, but balance isn't necessarily a strategy. So we asked a different question. If we were building this system from scratch today, would we configure these campuses in the same way? That question changes the room. It changes the way we think. Because when you remove legacy, politics, and the sunk cost, the configuration of what you have usually shifts. And if the answer is no, we wouldn't build it that way today, then the follow-up question is obvious. Why are we reinforcing it with new capital? Let's analyze the consequences of avoiding role clarity. If Riverside invests in high acuity services at multiple campuses, recruitment complexity increases, specialized equipment duplicates, call structures fragment, clinical volumes are spread even thinner, and market differentiation weakens. This isn't theoretical, it's structural. Now compare that to concentrated role definition. Campus A becomes a high acuity referral engine. Campus B becomes ambulatory forward with selective inpatient growth, and Campus C narrows scope and leans into outpatient and chronic disease infrastructure. Capital sharpens. This simplifies workforce and clarifies your marketing around these campuses. It strengthens your position for payer negotiations, and here's the direct takeaway. If you can't describe each campus in one forward-looking sentence, including what it will not do, your master plan is still operating on legacy assumptions, and legacy assumptions are expensive to preserve. Before any square footage is programmed, require written role definitions approved at the executive and board level. These are not implied, they are documented, because space follows strategy, not the other way around. Requirement 2. Design for the care model you're intentionally building. Now let's move from role to care model. Most master plans project current volumes forward. That's modeling. It's not direction setting. At Riverside, inpatient census was stable. Outpatient growth was accelerating. The length of stay was decreasing, and the payer pressure was increasing. Yet the early master plan emphasized a new inpatient tower. That's common. Beds are visible. They're easy to quantify. They're politically understandable. But here's the analytical question. What care model are we accelerating through this capital commitment? Let's run some scenarios. Scenario 1. Inpatient growth remains stable. Scenario 2. Inpatient growth declines 10% over 10 years. And scenario 3. Inpatient growth declines 20% and outpatient accelerates aggressively. If your new inpatient structure only functions optimally in scenario 1, you've built fragility into the system. Facilities influence behavior. If you overbuild inpatient capacity, leadership will feel pressure to maintain inpatient volumes to justify the investment. That's how buildings anchor outdated care models. So Riverside reframed the problem. Instead of asking, how many beds do we need? They asked, what physical configuration remains viable across multiple demand scenarios? That led to convertible room design, universal rooms, standardized unit layouts, shared infrastructure cores, shell space, preserved as optional capacity rather than immediate overbuilt. Flexibility is not aesthetic. It is an economic protection engine. Every major capital commitment should be stress tested under at least 3 demand assumptions. If the facility cannot adapt under reasonable volatility, redesign the plan before approval. Master planning must assume change. Projection-only planning assumes stability, and stability is no longer a safe assumption. Requirement 3. Integrate workforce probability before capital locks in. Now we address the workforce directly. Workforce modeling cannot be an appendix. It must precede design and precede planning. At Riverside, expanding high acuity orthopedics across 2 campuses initially appeared logical from an access standpoint. But workforce probability modeling told a different story. Recruitment data showed a limited pipeline of depth in orthopedic trauma, increasing burnout risk, rising premium labor costs, call coverage strain that it was already present. Let's quantify the exposure. If you expand across 2 campuses, you increase your required surgeon headcount, your specialized OR nurse demand, your anesthesia coverage, your on-call complexity, equipment duplication. Now lay a recruitment probability over that. If only 60 to 70% of projected hires materialize on time, the capital asset becomes structurally undersupported. That is not a short-term issue. That's embedded fragility. So Riverside concentrated high-acuity orthopedics at Campus A and expanded outpatient procedures at Campus B. Recruitment demand decreased, call structure simplified, capital intensity reduced. Here's the analytical takeaway. Every time you duplicate high-acuity services across campuses, you multiply staffing risk. Staffing risk compounds over time. Before approving multi-campus expansion, you should require 10-year recruitment probability modeling, attrition sensitivity analysis, call coverage stress simulations, and burnout exposure projections tied to spatial configuration. If workforce modeling doesn't materially influence design decisions and planning decisions, you are embedding operational volatility into fixed infrastructure, and that's misalignment. Requirement 4. Sequence capital for optionality, not momentum. Capital sequencing is often driven by visibility. A large first phase, visible construction, immediate impact. But visible does not mean resilient. At Riverside, the initial sequencing placed major inpatient expansion in Phase 1. It generated enthusiasm, but it reduced financial flexibility. So we ran stress simulations. If construction costs rise 10 to 15%, and if reimbursement compresses 5 to 8%, and elective volumes decline during an economic downturn, what happens to Phase 2? Under momentum sequencing, debt load increases, flexibility decreases, service concentration, and operational efficiency improvements. Phase 2 is a targeted procedural expansion, followed by Phase 3 with inpatient capacity deployment only if validated. That sequencing preserves maneuverability. Optionality is not indecision, it's structured patience. A practical test. Ask your finance team to model a 10% revenue contraction scenario against your master plan phasing. If the plan collapses under moderate stress, it's not resilient. Capital sequencing must assume volatility. Requirement 5. Embed governance architecture that prevents drift. Finally, governance. Most master plans do not collapse because of flawed design. They degrade through exception accumulation. A donor funds a non-aligned program. A new executive reintroduces duplication. A board member pressures localized expansion. Without deviation criteria, incremental drift becomes structural drift. At Riverside, the governance architecture included annual campus role validation, capital alignment reporting, explicit deviation thresholds, and board-level education on concentration logic. Now simulate leadership turnover. If the CEO leaves in year 6, does their master plan survive? If governance is personality dependent, it weakens immediately. If governance is structural, deviation requires justification against predefined criteria. Strategy must outlast individuals. If your master plan does not include deviation governance, it is dependent on alignment rather than strategy. Alignment shifts, strategy endures. In closing, a disciplined master facility plan must include an explicit campus role definition. Number 2, care model intentionality. 3, workforce probability integration. 4, capital sequencing for optionality. And 5, governance architecture that prevents drift. None of this is abstract. Strategic drift is dangerous. It is an unintentional phenomenon where strategy slowly becomes misaligned with its external environment. It clings to past successes despite shifting market conditions, technologies, and consumer needs. It's driven by complacency, organizational inertia, or poor leadership. It leads to declining performance, lost competitiveness, and eventual crisis. If even one of these 5 elements is missing, your plan may still function, but it will lack resilience. Before your next major capital improvement, think about asking a few new questions. Are we reinforcing legacy or committing to strategy? What futures are we intentionally eliminating? Does workforce probability support this footprint? Can this plan flex under financial stress? Will this survive leadership transition? If those questions slow the room down, that's productive. Because master planning at this level is not about optimism. It's about disciplined commitment under uncertainty. And disciplined commitment requires clarity. If this conversation resonated, it's likely because you're not just planning projects, you're stewarding long-term strategic risk. Master planning isn't a facilities exercise, it's a declaration of intent. And as we explored through Riverside Health, clarity around campus role, care model design, workforce probability, capital sequencing, and governance discipline isn't optional, it's protective. Each decision either compounds resilience or quietly embeds constraint. For healthcare executives, board members, planners, architects, and strategists, the real question isn't how bold your next investment will look. It's whether it will still make sense 10 years from now, under pressure, under leadership change, and under market volatility. If this episode sharpened your thinking, share it with a colleague who's navigating a master plan right now. Subscribe so you don't miss future conversations at the intersection of healthcare strategy and the built environment. And if you're wrestling with these decisions in your own organization, let's continue the dialogue. Because the architecture of healing isn't just about buildings and space, it's about disciplined choices that shape the future of care.